Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Today we look at Stephen French, a notorious Liverpool gangster. Stephen French is a well-known name across the UK, as well as many other countries. Mr. French seems to be a jack of all trades, having a background in many different industries and constantly pursuing different courses of life. With a tangled life path and seemingly no straight destination, Mr. French has a story with lots of plot twists. Stephen French began his rise to criminality as early as 1972. Since then, Mr. French has been involved in a variety of crimes, such as petty theft and robbery, all the way to severe burglary and assault claims. This UK gangster has brought other people into the world of organised crime as well as faced various charges throughout his lifetime, and spent numerous years in jail. The question is, what did a life of crime turn him into, and where did he end up today? Growing up in the 1960s, Mr. French did not have an easy childhood, nor was he able to be supported by a good family life at home. At an early age, Mr. French was removed from his family when it was discovered that his mother was not able to take care of him and his 4 siblings. Mr. French grew up in a town called Toxteth, a small inner city near Liverpool. While the elder 3 of his siblings were able to be put in the foster system after the family separation, Mr. French and his younger sibling were placed in a different type of care home because of their race. This unfortunate separation and discrimination may well have played a role into his deterrence from a normal life. The separation resulted in them growing up in a form of an orphanage, but under terrible conditions. Mr. French recalls that after meeting with a psychiatrist on many occasions, he ended up remembering suppressed memories from this part of his childhood. These are memories your brain hides on purpose because they cause damage to you at the time, so remembering them is hurtful and suppressing them helps you to feel better. Mr. French recounts that his care home was later shut down in the 1980s. During this shutdown, there were also about a dozen employees charged and tried for cases of physical and sexual abuse toward the children they tended for. From here on, Mr. French was involved in many activities of petty criminal activity during his childhood. Mr. French grew up with a very negative view of life, and also the idea that money was hard to come across. These 2 factors are commonly seen in the upbringing of soon-to-be criminals. A lot of teens that end up joining the world of street gangs don't have supportive families to rely on at home, and are commonly in dire need of money. As you can see, Mr. French was in a situation where both of these things were true for him, which as you can imagine cannot be easy to handle. Although this is no excuse for somebody to turn to the world of crime. This might explain what had happened to evolve such a life for him. For example, as the saying goes, both nature and nurture play a role in our lifetime's development. The environment you place a child in is almost always related to how their life ends up, and based on how he was raised, he was not put in a very good situation to make a life for himself. Interesting enough, aside from his life of street crime, Mr. French was also a professional mixed martial arts fighter, known as the Warrior. Mr. French had the record of being an ex-champion. He also had somewhat of a reputation in the film industry, and many TV appearances through 2008 to around 2019. He seems to have been well known in other industries, and not only for his gangster name that seemingly followed him wherever he went. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, when Mr. French was between his teenage years, he faced numerous charges and was already engulfed into the street gang life of petty crime. At this point, he was now involved in street criminal activity such as theft and house burglary. Mr. French has actually written a book about this, outlining the early stages of his life and how he spent his teenage years beginning to be involved in the gang activity. Since he was left without a support system at such a young age, we can assume that this is what led him into joining a street gang. This is an interesting viewpoint to how gangs can lure in children and why the enticement seems appealing. Young kids can sometimes be easily swayed against their will to joining this life of crime. However, this life doesn't turn out to be as good as the young kids think. Young teens are told they will have support from the group for life and will make enormous amounts of money from it. Children who join gangs at a young age are commonly roped in for life and begin to see the fierce consequences of not being able to leave the group. This is why gang members evolve their crime to grow from petty criminal activity to more serious arrest-worthy behaviours as they age. As the state of the drug business continued to prevail in Toxteth, Mr. French evolved and his behaviour grew with the times. With what he saw was an opportunity for fortune by abusing the people who had money to pay for drugs. By the time the late 80s and 90s came around, Mr. French was no longer involved in petty criminal activity and had moved on to robbing the richest people in the UK. Known as the taxer of the rich, Mr. French moved on to crime with a bigger reward, stealing from the most powerful crime lords in the UK. He knew these individuals had the most money to pay, and finding a way to take it from them was going to pay off big time. At this point, Mr. French was robbing city barons and torturing them until they pay large fines of money. These city barons were the largest illegal drug dealers across the UK, with large amounts of illicit money on them at all times. This was a prime opportunity in Mr. French's eyes to make a quick amount of money. These criminals could not report Mr. French to the government because their money is illicitly made, meaning if they report them, they're going to also be investigated. Mr. French manages to stay under the radar for quite some time, avoiding any serious fines or prison time at this point in his career. During the 80s and 90s, Mr. French managed to net over £20 million from these famous crime lords found across the UK. To take his illegal activity one step further, Mr. French was beginning to take youngsters from the gangs assimilated with him and turn them into criminals that followed his guide. A prime example of this is Curtis Warren. Curtis Warren began his career in gangster crime under the wing of Mr. French, who taught him his techniques and gave a way to make his own money across the streets. Mr. Warren ended up being named one of Britain's biggest drug dealers, actually titled as one of the richest men in the UK in 1997. Mr. Warren advanced his career from street crime and created a worldwide web of trafficking, generating huge amounts of illegal money that would end up leading him to some serious jail time. Once this network across the world was detected by authorities, Mr. Warren was put behind bars after failing to pay back £198 million. French pretty much brought up to one of the UK's most notorious criminals, who to this day is still in prison. It is clear to see that Mr. French has had a building career of crime since his early childhood. This again speaks on the ability of gangs to take a young child without a good support system and convince them to rely on illegal activity to make their way in life. Mr. French's story doesn't get much better from here, only starting to spiral downwards into worse activities that end up landing him in some jail time. What is interesting about Mr. French is that he does not follow a straight or usual life of a street criminal. Mr. French created a really distinctive name for himself, being a self-proclaimed peace activist and also an anti-gun campaigner. Mr. French also did grow up in a very rich lifestyle, and although started off in an orphanage with no family and nearly no money, did end up making lots of capital off property investments. This goes to show that he had an opportunity to clean his life up and distance himself from criminal activity. Mr. French goes on for nearly 10 years after some of his petty crime charges to portray himself as a highly reformed Christian and a peace provider. This is interesting because even after living a life of prompting peace and within communities and having a stand-up job for himself, his reputation is still to be damaged in the future with these allegations and incarcerations that are soon to come. This nice guy reputation does not last for very long, and continues to be broken apart when his crime stories return to the media yet again. Once he moved on from petty burglary and car theft, Mr. French ended up in some more serious situations. In 2009, Mr. French was tried and put in jail for 3 years after being caught possessing a knife and threatening one of his business associates with a fake firearm. This incarceration is one of the first events leading up to the rest of his jail time and charges that are pressed later on in his life. He is again incarcerated for pistol whipping or using a handgun as a weapon of blunt force a fellow businessman. He later tossed the essentially fake gun as well as a machete into the nearby river, the River Mersey. Mr. French was handed a 3-year term for attacking said businessman at an office complex near Liverpool City. After only spending approximately 2 years behind bars, Mr. French was released to live on parole according to some very strict conditions. As you may know, parole conditions and rules are serious, and any breach can land you back in prison just as quickly as you were released. However, this release again doesn't last very long. Although Mr. French was given the specific limitations of what he was allowed to do while he was out of jail, it's been reported that rather than stick to these guidelines and report to the probation centre as directed, he chose to live by his own will and go against these rules. In 2015, Mr. French was caught on photograph sitting at a Liverpool soccer game next to one of the football stars. This media attention is one of the things that brought him back into the spotlight at nearly 55 years old. Mr. French was caught breaking the rules of his probation, which landed him back in jail in order to finish his sentence from 2013's assault charges. This is another time when the media attention was almost fully set on him, exemplifying how he continued to switch back from a life of crime to a life of being a peace campaigner. Nobody could understand the constant changes in direction. After serving the rest of his sentence in 2013's conviction, Mr. French again stayed out of the media eye for the next few years. However, if you've been following the story so far, you can probably guess that this isn't the end yet. In 2016, Mr. French's story makes a really interesting twist, this time in an unfortunate manner for him. Although Mr. French has been in and out of jail and fighting convictions for the majority of his life, this time he faced allegations of a more serious criminal activity. Charged with 2 counts of rape and lethal threats, Mr. French appeared in court during April of 2016 to fight back against these allegations. It seems fair to say that based on his history, the odds were most likely not in his favour, regardless of whether he is guilty or not. It seems almost impossible that the courts will side with him at this point. The women who came forward with the allegations against him seem to have a very disheartening story about the tales she was telling him. Coming from a life of crime with multiple jail times and incarcerations behind him, Mr. French didn't seem like the most honest and trustworthy guy, making it really hard for the courts to believe him when he was denying these allegations. At 56 years old, Mr. French was being charged with 2 rape allegations. Even more so, this woman's son filed that Mr. French made threats to kill him as well. These trials took place at the Liverpool Crown Court. The son had heard an argument between Mr. French and his mother happening in the house. He says that he could hear what sounded like spitting going on between them, as if they were angry with each other. First his mum spitting at Mr. French, and then the return. Out of curiosity and apprehension, the son approached the area of the house where Mr. French and his mother were, and found his mum lying on the floor in obvious pain. Although the son cannot claim to have seen Mr. French commit any physical act, he naturally tried to push Mr. French away, out of the assumption that Mr. French had hurt his mother. Following this, the son tells the court that Mr. French aggressively approached him during this situation and threatens to kill everyone in the family if he gets him arrested. Knowing Mr. French's reputation and fearing that the threat did hold some truth to it, the son took action instead of shrugging it off. The mother and son contacted the police, and so these charges were made. However, this case doesn't end there. Mr. French completely denied any accusation of raping the woman. With a good defence lawyer on his side, the charges ended up being dropped when there was no evidence of the act of sexual abuse. His defence lawyer also claimed that some of the prosecution's evidence was in fact faulty and totally unreliable. Mr. French did, however, plead guilty to the charge of threatening the son, and so these charges were continued accordingly. From here, Mr. French was given 16 weeks in prison and a 5-year-long restraining order against the family, after admitting to threatening the son that day. He was legally recorded as not guilty for the 2 counts of rape and assault. So Mr. French again ended up in prison, possibly for one of the more violent allegations he faced over his lifetime. Although most of his crimes were fraudulent acts of robbery, this media attention was much worse. Now finished with his most recent sentence, Mr. French has again returned to his character of a reborn Christian, running anti-gun campaigns and peace protests. Known as the fighting preacher, French seems to be trying this more devout path of life and possibly straying away from the street crime and gangs. However, this does not seem to be the first time he has taken a break, since his life route is far from being normal. Many individuals have gone public with their statements and thoughts about Mr. French, stating that coming out of a life of crime is difficult to do. Although Mr. French may very well want to live a normal life and forget about his younger, less modest days, these demons are not so easy to let go of. A big issue spoken about on his behalf is the amount of people looking to cause some harm to him. After all, he stole from and tormented so many big-name criminals back in the time of illegal activity that it seems he will forever have to watch his back. The so-called devil could very well have a genuine desire to live opposite to how people know and remember him, but this could prove to be difficult. Mr. French is known as an advocate for anti-gun violence despite his past, as well as being a supporter of the Christian religion. Mr. French is now devoted to living his life to helping others, which includes showing young people why they should stay away from the life of crime. In many of his interviews, he discusses how he uses his own experiences to teach people to stay away from organised crime. No matter your living conditions, even with a life in and out of prison, he seems to act quite as an advocate for being on your best behaviour. On another strange note, Mr. French also frequently discusses the difference between his crimes and the crimes we are seeing happening now. It is as though he believes his form of criminal behaviour is somehow above others, placing himself as one of the better robbers and thieves in history. He often discusses how his form of crime was to rob someone, tie them up and walk away with the money in his pocket. This in comparison to today's world, where we see more of gun violence and unnecessary killings. It is indeed an interesting comparison, but not something that's unheard of from old school criminals who think of themselves above these younger criminals who perform almost identical acts. This is especially true for Mr. French, as he does have a history of charges against him for assault and violent cases in his younger days. However, if we are to take a look at where he is now, Mr. French seems to be living almost his normal life, or a life as normal as it can be for an ex-criminal with such a deep history. It's not every day that you see somebody with a background such as himself be able to broadcast themselves as being a person with such high values and a peaceful reputation. Seemingly bouncing back from crime to a heavy religious life, and even leading peace protests and civil rights movements. Mr. French has been involved with a lot of high-level criminals throughout his lifetime, and some who may always have bad blood towards him. Regardless of personal opinion on Mr. French, he has been through a lot throughout his life, and gained so much experience that he is now able to tell his story and help those who might be growing up in a similar circumstance as himself to find a way to change or take a better path. We hope Mr. French is able to continue spreading his knowledge to the younger generation and is able to stay focused and not get drawn back into the criminal underworld. The life and crimes committed by Stephen French will never be forgotten about in the UK criminal underworld. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.